The trains were rolling. On the gravel outside Millbrook Station, a scene was unfolding that made the whole town stop and hold its breath. A man, his suit wrinkled and his face haggard, stood on an old wooden crate, shouting to the assembled crowd. Beside him was a woman in a faded blue dress, clutching 6 dusty children, tears streaking her cheeks. The whole family for only $10. If anyone wants a cook, a tailor, and 6 healthy, well-behaved children. This is the best opportunity. A dry laugh broke out from the crowd, but no one came forward. The woman did not raise her head. The oldest boy, about 14, stood straight, his eyes cold and frightened at the same time. The youngest was still clinging to his mother's skirt, tears still not yet dry. In the midst of that suffocating market, a figure stepped out from the distance, Cowboy Ezra Blackwood. Stopping on the sandy ground, he had not intended to stop here. He had only wanted to find a hot meal, perhaps a job that would last more than 3 days. But what he saw, not a market scene. Butacile exécution. A family sold like cattle. A father who had lost his humanity, a mother who swallowed her tears, and 6 children who had not yet understood why their lives had turned into hell. A woman's voice from the crowd spoke coldly. "I'll pay 12, but I'll only take 3. I need someone to do the housework." The seller shook his head. "No, the whole family or nothing." The whole place fell silent. No one offered more. No one wanted to get involved in this. Everyone had a reason to turn away. But at that moment, Ezra could not turn away. His hand tightened on the horse's reins. He could hear the wind, the sound of the approaching train. And then he spoke. His voice was not loud, but it was firm, echoing in the air, heavy with despair. $15. Low. Everyone fell silent. The woman in the green hat paused. The vendor looked down. Catherine, the mother of 6, looked up. In that moment, their eyes met. Time seemed to stand still. Those eyes did not beg, did not plead. There was only one silent question. Do you really see us as human beings? Ezra did not know why he said it. There was no calculation. He only knew that he could not stand to watch. $15. The vendor said again, half in disbelief, half trying to provoke a higher price. Who paid 16? No one spoke. 15. Once. 15. Twice. Catherine was still looking at Ezra. The children clung to each other. 15. 3 times. Sold. Low. A collective sigh went through the crowd. A few shook their heads. A few scoffed. But most walked away quietly. They would talk about what they had just witnessed, whisper it in the tavern, tell it by the fire. But no one dared to interfere. Ezra stepped forward, reaching into his leather money bag, almost all he had. The loose change clinked in the seller's hand. $15. For a family. The words rang out in the harsh Nebraska sun, a clumsy phrase, but one that carried 1,000 times more weight than a grand promise. It wasn't a deal, it was a choice that defined Ezra. Catherine's voice rang out, soft but firm. I'm Catherine Henley. This is James, Mary, Michael, Peter, Annie, and Ruth. Ezra nodded. He looked at each child. Some looked at him suspiciously. Some huddled behind their mothers. Some were still scared. He didn't know what to do next. He didn't have a plan. He didn't have a house big enough. But he knew he had done the right thing. We have to leave before dark. Ezra said. He led them to his cabin, more than 10 miles from town. Only that, from that moment on, none of them were sold anymore. And he, for the first time in 32 years of being alone, had something to return to. Scene change. The sky was graying. Wooden wheels rolling over rocks. The sound of children quieting. Catherine sitting with Ruth, her eyes still in disbelief. Wind blowing through the meadow. A family temporarily saved. And you, if you were Ezra at that moment, what would you do? Keep that question in mind, because the answer will follow them for the rest of their lives, and maybe yours. The sun was low on the horizon when Ezra's old wooden wagon rolled to the edge of the woods where the little cabin nestled among the rustling oaks. The family was silent for the 10 miles, the only sounds being the creaking of the wheels, the heavy breathing of the horses, and the wind blowing across the burnt yellow pastures. Ezra's house was no bigger than a town kitchen. The walls were rough-hewn wood. The roof was made of old corrugated iron with holes in it, and the door frame leaned to one side, but smoke rose from the chimney. There was firewood stacked against the side of the house, and most important, 4 walls that stood firm against the morning wind and evening dew. That was all Ezra had, and now he had to make it a home for 7 strangers. Ezra dismounted, tied Dusty's reins to a makeshift stake, and turned to help Catherine down from the wagon. She held Ruth in her arms, the baby still fast asleep, her tiny hand clinging to her mother's collar. The 6 children stood close together, dirty, tired, and alert. James stepped down last, his eyes darting around not to admire but to check. Check for an exit, a place to hide if things got bad. Ezra caught his gaze and nodded. He said nothing, but the thought was clear. This boy had been forced to protect his family while his father had abandoned him. "It's not very spacious," Ezra said, opening the door, "but it'll keep the rain out, and the wind won't be too strong if we keep the doors closed." He paused, then added, almost to himself, "For now, Inside was a single large room, save for a corner roughly partitioned off as a bedroom. The wood creaked underfoot, the smell of old smoke, road dust, and horsehide mingled. A wooden table stood in the center of the room with 2 old chairs. In the left corner was a fireplace, still smoldering with ashes, and a small iron pot on a shelf. A ladder led up to the attic, where Ezra had previously stored his things. "Come in," Ezra said. "I'll start the fire." Catherine went in first. Without asking, without criticizing, she laid Ruth down on the old blanket Ezra had spread out. Mary, Mishael, Peter, Annie, and James followed, still staring at every corner as if something might emerge from the darkness. Ezra fanned the fire. The flames began to flicker in the grate. He didn't look at anyone, but he was aware of every movement, the breathing, the rustle of cloth, the creaking of the floor. When someone stepped lightly, he felt as if he had just brought a flock of baby birds into a nest, but this nest was empty, cold, and cramped. He didn't know how to raise a child, let alone 7, but he knew one thing: they wouldn't be separated. Not again. "I didn't know how to raise a family, but I knew how to keep them together. There's some dry bread," Ezra said, his voice low. "It's not very good, but we'll have it tonight. Tomorrow I'll go fishing on the river." Catherine nodded. "I can cook. Let me borrow the pan." There wasn't much conversation at dinner that night. Everyone ate in silence. The dry bread and the leftover beans, but the fire in the stove was glowing, glinting in the children's hair. The baby was starting to yawn. Mary had fallen asleep on her mother's shoulder. Peter was huddled next to Michael, eyes closed, but legs still moving. Annie was sucking her thumb. James was still awake, sitting by the door, eyes always on the outside. Ezra noticed he hadn't left protective mode. "When your father left," James said quietly, Suddenly, you thought you were the only sane person in the house. Ezra didn't answer. He poured more hot water into the iron mug. You're not like your father. That's true. Not because I'm nicer. Ezra said, it's just, I've been lost before, and I know when to stop. And James was silent. After a moment he said, do you know how to fight? Enough to not get punched twice. And were you scared to bring them back? Ezra looked into the fire. I was scared. I've never been a father. But I know one thing. When I saw you on that platform, I couldn't turn away. Not because you needed me. Because I needed to do it right once. The wind blew through the crack in the door, making the firelight dance. A small mouse scurried across the mantelpiece, then disappeared into the dark corner. Catherine pulled the blanket back over Ruth. Outside, it was starting to rain. James stood up and walked toward the mezzanine. There's a leak, he said. Yeah, Ezra said. I'll fix it tomorrow. James posed. I'll help tomorrow. Ezra nodded. No thanks needed. No explanation needed. A nod was all it took. That night, the tent was packed. Ezra slept on a chair, knife still in his trouser leg. An old habit that had not been broken. Catherine slept on the floor with the children. The rain pounded on the roof. The wind made the walls creak. But no one panicked. No one cried. There was only the steady breathing, the soft snores of children, and warmth beginning to form in the coldest place. Somewhere inside Ezra, for the first time, he felt he was not alone. No longer a horseman who rode from town to town, nameless, waiting for no one, but a man with a place to return to, someone to protect. And if he had to rebuild his whole home, his whole life, he would start tonight, with the leaky roof, with the rats, with the cold beans, but with James's unguarded eyes, with the sound of Ruth sleeping peacefully, and with Catherine's hand pulling the covers over her child. This hut was small, old, leaky, but now it could be home, because where hearts begin to belong to each other, that is where it all begins. That morning, a cold wind blew through the oak trees, rustling ominously. Ezra was repairing the roof of the barn with James. The sun was not quite up yet, and dew was still on the grass. But the peace lasted only a moment. The sound of horses' hooves echoed from the path leading to the farm, not the slow, familiar sound of a horse-drawn cart, but a hurried, determined sound. The sound of a man with a purpose and, usually not a good one. Ezra paused, his eyes as tense as a bowstring. He glanced at James. Down. In the house. Call your mother out. Lock the door. Understood. James said nothing, but acted like a grown man. He jumped off the roof and ran toward the house. Ezra drew his gun and stepped into the yard, which had been swept that morning. 3 men on horseback stopped less than 20 paces away. Leading the way was Henry Henleith, man who had sold his wife and child for $15 silver. His shirt was rumpled, his hair was disheveled, and the smell of alcohol wafted from afar. His eyes were red, but his voice was colder than the early winter wind. I came to get my family back, Henry said, dismounting. Ezra didn't draw his gun, but kept his hands at his sides. You sold them? In front of the whole town? $15. Remember, no right to keep my wife. My kids, Henry growled. I'm her husband, the father of the kids. What law gives you the right to take them? What law gives you the right to sell them like cattle? Ezra said, his voice low but thunderous. And I don't take them. I only stand up when you choose to give up. Zah. Henry took another step, his face red. The 2 men behind him, Money with a long scar down his cheek. The other blonde, with a sly eye, began to spread out on either side, closing in on Ezra. "Don't do anything stupid," Ezra said. "This is my land. Take another step and there's no turning back." Catherine had seen it from inside the house. Her hands trembled as she touched the gun hidden under the blankets. She picked Ruth up and handed it to Mary, then pulled open the back door and stepped out. The cold wind cut through her thin skirt, but her eyes burned like fire. "Henry," Catherine called. He turned. In her hand was a small gunshot, big, not new, but loaded. "What are you doing here?" "I know," Henry said, his voice slipping like the alcohol in his blood. "You're my wife. The children are mine. I have the right to take you back." "Oh, right?" Catherine's voice broke in a tremor. "What right do you have after selling us out in front of the whole town? You stood there, watching the children cry, watching me began, then walked straight into the tavern. You call that a right?" Henry was taken aback. For a moment, his eyes fell. Then he laughed, hoarsely. "I messed up, but I fixed it. I'm back, and now you're coming back with me. It's all going to be okay." "Esprike." "We're not coming back," James said, stepping out from the shade of the porch. He held the long gun, Ezra's spare. His hands were clenched, but his eyes were unblinking. "Is that my son?" Henry said. His voice choked. "Put the gun down." "James, it's Dad." My dad's dead," James said, slowly, each word echoing off the ground. "He died standing on that crate and selling us. And me, I'm protecting my family." The scarred man reached for the hilt. Catherine raised the gun. Without a moment's hesitation, "Let's see," she said, her eyes blazing. "Let's see if I can shoot." "Zero!" A scream tore through the air. "Yah!" From behind the stable, 8-year-old Peter rushed out, wielding a tree branch and lashing it hard at the rear of the horse that was tied there. The 3 horses reared up, neighing and galloping away. The 2 men behind them rushed to keep the reins, leaving Henry alone in the middle of the yard. Ezra took a step forward. "You're all tongue now, and I've heard enough." Henry looked around. There was no one behind him. His wife pointed the gun at him. His son called him a stranger. The people in front of him, the people he thought were his, were ready to fight to keep this little piece of heaven from him. "This is their home," Ezra said, his voice slow. "And I won't let anyone, not even you, take back what you've given up." And Henry said nothing. His eyes were no longer angry, just empty. He looked at Catherine, at Ruth, at each of the children he had lost, then turned and walked out without another word. Catherine lowered the gun, her hands still shaking slightly. James put the gun on the table. Relieved, Peter ran toward Ezra, saying nothing but clinging to his legs. "We're not going back," Catherine said, almost in a whisper. Ezra looked at her, then at the children standing around them like an invisible wall, shielding each other. "No," he said, "we're never going back." From a distance, Henry climbed into the saddle, not turning around. His 2 companions had secured their horses, but their eyes were bewildered. They didn't understand how such a simple plan had failed. They didn't understand because they had never known what could make a man like Ezra risk everything. The wind blew through the leaky roof, through the uncultivated turnip patch, through the rickety wooden fence, but it blew through their hearts too. And this time, there was no smell of alcohol, no old ghosts. There was only the feeling they had saved the most precious thing. Family wasn't something to be bought. Family was something to be fought for. And now, for the first time, Ezra wasn't just the one who had saved them. He was their father, the real thing. Not because of blood, but because he had chosen to stay. and they had chosen to trust him, choose to belong together. 3 days after his encounter with Henry Henley, the atmosphere in the house had barely calmed down when a horse appeared from the direction of town. The autumn wind blew the yellow dust from the dirt road leading to the farm. Ezra stood by the water trough, hammering in wooden nails. When he heard the familiar sound of hooves, he didn't have to turn to know who was coming. Sheriff Thomas Morrison, the man who kept order in the area, was a sturdy man in his 50s. He tied up his horse and walked straight to the porch. Unhurried, unnerved, but his eyes were serious and carried the weight of things left unsaid. "Good morning," he said when Ezra stepped out to greet him. "I think it's time we had a proper talk." Ezra nodded, signaling him to come in. Inside, Catherine was making soup from leftover vegetables from the garden. The scent of onions and carrots mingled, fragrant. Ruth was crawling around on the floor. Mary was teaching Annie to spell. James was reading an old book by the fireplace. But when Sheriff Morrison entered, the house fell silent. "No need to be so tense," he said, half laughing. "I didn't come for trouble. Quite the opposite." Ezra poured water and set it on the table. "I guess it's about Henry." The sheriff nodded. "He came to my office, screaming that you kidnapped his family, threatened the law, robbed people, demanded that I arrest you immediately." "And what do you think?" Ezra asked, his eyes never leaving him. "I think," Morrison leaned back in his chair, "that a man sold the most valuable thing he had, and then found out he couldn't buy it back with money. I also think that no one would sell another man's soul without paying the price." And there was a pause. In the kitchen, the faint sound of a spoon stirring a pot resounded. "I've looked into it," the sheriff continued. "Asked nearly 20 people at the station that day. No one said you did anything wrong. Quite the contrary. They said you were the only one with the courage to act when they were all just watching." "Yeah." Ezra did not reply, but his hand tightened on his glass. Morrison placed a small silver object on the table, a 6-pointed Stara deputy sheriff's badge, hand engraved, slightly worn at the edges. "In this part of the country," he said slowly, "we need more than written laws. We need people who can stand between right and wrong. Not because they have orders, but because they know what is right. I think you are one of those people." Ezra looked at the badge, silent for a long time. In his head he heard Henry's voice, Catherine's voice, the sound of small footsteps running around the house, the sound of a gun fired in the yard. He had never thought of himself as a man of the law. He had thought the law was made for the strong. But now, sitting here, between the cramped roof and the wood stove, he understood. The law also needed to be used by people who once had nothing in their hands but a right choice. "I've never been a cop," Ezra said, his eyes never leaving the badge. "I don't know how to write reports. I don't know how to arrest people. But I know how to keep a promise. I know how to protect what I believe is right. If you think that's enough," the sheriff laughed. "In this part of the world, sometimes that's more than enough." Ezra took the badge. It wasn't heavy, but as he placed it on his chest, it felt like an oath had been carved into him. From now on, if anyone came to take his family by force or by any other name, they would face not just a man with a gun, but a man of the law, official and legal. "I accept," Ezra said, not loudly, but loud enough for Catherine, standing in the kitchen, to hear. Sheriff Morrison nodded. "Standing up. Tomorrow. I want you in the office. Meet the rest of the force. Review paperwork. Issue weapons if necessary." End of pause. Before he went out the door, he paused, turned to Catherine. "Madam," he said softly, If you are concerned about legality, you and your children are protected not only by the law, but by the seal of the law. End of PUAN. Catherine said nothing, but as the door closed, she walked over to Ezra, touching the badge on his shirt with her finger. "Is it heavy?" she asked softly. "No," Ezra said, "but the meaning is heavier than anything I have ever carried." Dad. James stood nearby. He had heard everything. He stepped forward, held out his hand. "Deputy Sheriff," he said, half joking, half serious. "We have legal authority now." Dad. Ezra took his hand. "Not just authority, responsibility." Dad. That afternoon, as the late afternoon sun gilded the wooden fence around the cabin, Ruth crept closer and pointed to the silver star on her father's chest. "Bright," she said. "Beautiful. Simply one." Ezra held his daughter close. He didn't know if she understood what the item meant, but he did, and Catherine did, and the land would understand. Too, one doesn't need to be born into a family to choose to be a protector of what one loves most. And sometimes, the law itself needs to be rewritten by the kindness of an ordinary person. The Millbrook schoolhouse was right next to the little church with the white steeple, where children from all over the neighborhood gathered every morning. Mary Blackwood, her hair in pigtails and a blue dress her mother had made, walked into the classroom, as she always did. But that day, the other children's eyes were on her, not because of the lessons, but because of the gossip that had been going on all week. That girl was bought at the train station. Someone whispered, "Her current father is just a cowboy." Another chimed in. Mary heard everything. She didn't cry, didn't scream. She just sat quietly in her seat, opened her book, and wrote. But when the class ended, Tommy Morrison, the sheriff's nephew, stood blocking the exit. "You should know your place." "Mary," he said, his voice dripping with scorn, "you don't really belong here. You can't just buy a family." Mary looked straight into Tommy's eyes. She felt her heart beating fast, not with fear, but with anger, not because he had insulted her, but because he knew nothing about Ezra, about Mother, about rainy nights and fires in the fireplace, about how Ezra slept under a broken roof so they could stay dry, about how he didn't buy them, he chose them. "You're wrong," Mary said, her voice low but clear. "Family isn't something you're born with. It's something you choose to keep when you have the right to leave." In the poem, Tommy blushed, stammered something, but Mary was already walking past. She didn't turn around, didn't need to do anything more. She had said what she needed to say. Her story, Ezra's, wasn't for anyone to judge. It was a manifesto of love, chosen, not imposed. That afternoon, as Catherine was teaching Ruth to roll dough in the kitchen, Mary came in, silent, setting her bag on a chair. Catherine glanced at her daughter, noticing the strange look in her eyes. "Is something wrong at school?" Mary shook her head. "Nothing you can't handle." "Suba." Catherine didn't ask any more. She smiled, handing Mary a peeler. "Then help me cut the apples. Ruth wants to make apple pie." "Suba." Outside, Ezra was instructing Peter to fix a wooden wheel that was out of alignment. The boy tried to turn the nail, grimacing at the stiffness of the spring. Ezra sat next to him, not doing anything for him, just patiently explaining each step. Being a father, Ezra thought, isn't about doing all the hard work. It's about standing by while the child learns to overcome the hard work. A few meters away, James was holding an old rifle, showing Michael how to load it, how to keep his balance, how to control his breathing. Michael asked about everything from the hammer mechanism to the recoil after the shot. James answered every word, his eyes as bright as the early summer sun. That evening, the family gathered around the wooden table that Ezra had carved from an old oak tree behind the house. Oat soup, golden brown pies, steamed vegetables from the garden, and an apple pie for which Ruth happily took credit. Ezra reached out to stroke her hair, and she laughed. "You know," Mary said suddenly, "I told my friend today that I was happier being chosen by heart than being born and abandoned." No one spoke for a few seconds. Then Catherine stood up and hugged her daughter. "I'm proud you knew that sooner than I did." James nodded. "Me too. I didn't believe it at first. I thought Ezra was just pitying me. But now I know true love doesn't come from obligation. It comes from staying." Ezra clenched his fists, trying to keep his voice steady. "I never thought I was good enough to be a father. But you make me want to try every day." "And," Michael chimed in, "so, are you going to give us apple pie all week?" "Because we were good at learning how to shoot guns and no one broke a gun." The table laughed. That night, after the kids were in bed, Ezra and Catherine sat on the porch. The moonlight fell on the roof, patched with 3 different types of wood, and the light reflected off the patchwork like holiday lights. "I think the kids understand what home is," Catherine said, leaning on her husband's shoulder. "It's not 4 walls. It's people who are willing to sit together, listen, protect, forgive." Ezra nodded. "I used to think I wasn't enough to support a family, but I've never felt so full." Catherine squeezed his hand. "Family isn't blood. It's what you choose to keep every day, every meal, every hug." In the distance, the owls hoot low. The grass rustles in the wind. In that house, the children sleep peacefully, no longer afraid of being separated, no longer afraid of being sold, no longer afraid of not being kept. They know that no matter how life changes outside, here, in the vast Nebraska fields, they are chosen, loved, and never abandoned. And that is what makes a family. The late autumn afternoon spread gold across the vast Nebraska fields. A gentle breeze blew through the oak trees in front of the house, sending the last leaves of the season fluttering as if waving to the setting sun. Ezra Blackwood leaned back on a wooden bench, his arms wrapped around his little granddaughter, who was watching him with eager eyes. "Tell me again," she said, her black hair tied in a blue ribbon, swaying with the movement. "The story of the day you traded $15 for a family." "Oh," Ezra smiled, the smile of someone who had lived long enough to know that some stories are told not to show off, but to remind him of a choice, a moment, and a person he once was. He looked out at the field, where cows grazed leisurely in the late afternoon sun. The sound of children chasing each other in the yard, the sound of the kitchen door opening and closing, and the smell of apple pie drifting on the wind brought back to him the image of a little child sucking her thumb by the fire. Ruth, now a mother of 2. That day, he began slowly. "I didn't think I was doing anything great. I just saw a mother and children about to be separated, and I knew that if I turned away, I wouldn't be myself." "Oh." The girl sat still, her eyes wide, in the twilight. Her face was exactly like Mary's, as a child, proud, intelligent, and full of emotion. "You didn't have much," Ezra continued. "Just a horse, a leaky hut, and some skill with a cow. But you had something you thought was worth more than anything, determination to never let an innocent person be abandoned again." Veld, behind them, the door opened. Catherine stepped out, her hair streaked with grey, but her gaze as warm as ever. She put the tea tray down on the small table beside the chair and sat down beside her husband. She said nothing, just quietly took his hand. "Mother said she thought you were crazy," the little girl whispered, half joking. Catherine smiled. "Maybe it's true, but without that crazy man, there would be no family, no children, no mother, no laughter that filled the house every night." Then Ezra looked at his wife. After all these years, her eyes were still the place where he found peace after every storm. "I think," Catherine said, her voice as light as the wind, "that Cowboy was the one who made the most money in that fateful trade." "Eman." No one answered. "No need." That sentence was like a full stop, gently closing a chapter of life. Not loud, not flashy, but profound. Ezra's eyes stopped on the horizon, where the sun was sinking behind the trees. He stared for a long time, as if he could see the image of a train station market years ago, where a lone man had reached out, not to save anyone, but to affirm that there were things in life worth believing in, worth holding on to, worth fighting for. A strong wind blew, carrying the smell of burnt grass, ripe apples, and laughter from inside the house. Ezra closed his eyes for a moment. He needed nothing more. No gold, no medals, just to be here, among the people he had chosen and who had chosen him back. That was the greatest value in a person's life. And sometimes it all started with a very small moment, a very simple sentence, a decision that didn't need much reason. $15 to buy back a life and create a whole generation